The title of the book at the moment is that, and the basic conjecture is that for many years Europe was caught between sort of cultural and national struggles between the French and the Germans after the war, and I'll talk about it. And then what really happened was in the 1980s that morphed into something quite monstrous when monetarism came along. And that's when the groupthink really became destructive. So for those who aren't aware of this concept in social psychology, the concept of groupthink is a group dynamic where the group gets caught up in thought processes that lead them to self-deception, to have coercive ways of obtaining consent within the group of what's knowledge and what isn't knowledge, and also strict conformity to the ethics and values of the group. And moreover, it disciplines the way in which the group conducts its operations, its so-called science, its activities. It defines questions that are valid to ask and explore, and it also defines areas of thought that are not valid to ask. So basically that's where the denial comes in. A whole range of issues and questions aren't allowed to be asked, and evidence that might bear upon those questions is filtered out of the discussion. And these quotes are from Irving Janis. He was the one who first introduced this concept. And it avoids it forces each member into I've had the flu, thanks to Michael. Not really. It requires each member to avoid any controversy. And there's for those that are familiar with the academic hierarchy, it's a way in which you can move up the hierarchy normally if you obey the dynamics and the rules of the groupthink. And it's like a sort of mob rule. That's the way you can think of it. And they become oblivious and hostile to any new ways of thinking. And they reject new ways of thinking, but also actively vilify people who might come in with different ideas. So the early years, the discussion, of course, of European integration and common monetary policy go back to the immediate post-war period. And the motivations for the main players were quite different. So France wanted to be the big deal in Europe, and in a way the big deal in the world. It had its sense of nationhood extended well beyond its capacities and the possibilities. And it also wanted to prevent Germany from ever invading it again. There'd been a number of obvious wars in. The French were still reeling from the 1871 Franco-Prussian War and wanted never to have Germany turn up on its doorstep again. And all of those border disputes in Alsace and Lorraine, they never wanted to get involved in that again. But the French were fiercely nationalistic, of course, and didn't want to hand over it. So they wanted a vehicle to contain Germany, but they also didn't want to hand over any sovereign powers to that vehicle, whatever it might be. So their concept of Europe was an intergovernmental sets of agreements and committees, not Brussels, not a separate supranational power, but arrangements and structures that the governments agreed that they would be players in to keep Germany from misbehaving. Now, the motivation of the Germans can broadly be thought of as, Germany was in total shame after the way they'd behaved during the Second World War. They had no national pride at all, and what they did have was very good organisation, very good technical capacity, and the capacity to run a really strong economy that probably was greater than its European neighbours. And also, once the Bundesbank Act was consolidated after the big monetary crisis in the late 40s, and again reflecting their history during the Weimar period of the hyperinflation, they also had this thing about this obsession about price stability that they believed could be exported and be a strength within European economic culture. And so for them, the only way they could re-establish themselves as anything like have national pride was to become a citizen of Europe again. And so their motivation for political integration and doing deals with its European neighbours were firmly in that sort of mould. And so you can see that the motivations were quite separate and could never really be brought together. The early discussions led in the late 60s to a major meeting in The Hague Summit in 1969. And that summit commissioned Pierre Werner, who was then the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, to assemble a committee to work out a plan for monetary union. And even that decision was a compromise, and because the French wanted one thing, Germans wanted another. Need I add that the first major step that the Europeans made towards political integration after the Treaty of Rome was the Common Agricultural Policy. And the import of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was a price harmonisation scheme across all countries, very complex institution. The import of that is that it really locked them into fixed exchange rates, because a system of common agricultural prices across all the different products would have been totally unworkable if given the exchange rate fluctuations. And so effectively they locked themselves in at that point to having to have fixed exchange rates. The Werner Report came out in 1970, and essentially it outlined a three-stage plan to have full monetary union by the end of the 1970s. The important point was that it was we might stylise it as a Keynesian document, in the sense that it recognised that an effective monetary union had to have a federal fiscal capacity, at the same in line with the monetary capacity held by the central bank, and that the lender of last resort had to be situated at the federal level, and that for asymmetric shocks that might occur, you had to have a federal government which could then bail out individual states or regions within the federation. And that Werner also was cognizant of the fact that once you do have a federal fiscal capacity, then the questions of democratic rights and democratic legitimacy became important, because you're taking these capacities out of the states and you're putting them into this new capacity. And so they wanted his committee clearly believed that the European Parliament could become much more important and responsible for fiscal policy. The next big report was the 1977 McDougall report, which basically said the same thing, but concluded that the degree of disparity within the European states in terms of culture, ambitions, economic structures, willingness to participate in a federation and all those other characteristics that might necessarily be required to be part of a functioning federation were not present. And the conclusion was it would be nothing in the foreseeable future could see that an effective federation could be formed. Now, during this time, of course, the various fixed exchange rate systems, first of all the snake, then the snake in the tunnel during the Smithsonian era after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, and then the late 70s they formed the European monetary system, which were all versions of a fixed exchange rate system. They were always in crisis. And they were in crisis because the economies were so different. The export strength of the Germans was always forcing the mark up to the upper bounds of the agreed limits. And of course that always would be forcing the other currencies within Europe to the bottom of the agreed bounds. And there were various machinations within each of these sequenced exchange rate arrangements. But effectively what it came down to is that there was no symmetry in the central bank behaviour. So the EMS, for example, demanded that the central banks behave symmetrically, which meant that if the mark was at the upper end and the French franc was at the lower end, then the Bank of France had to be buying up French francs at the same time as the Bundesbank had to be buying up French francs and selling German marks. And of course the cultural obsession within hyperinflation that the Germans had meant that they wouldn't play ball because they were scared to death. They were scared to death that if they were selling marks hugely into the foreign exchange markets, there'd be inflation because the money supply would go up in marks. And so you've got this asymmetric interventions occurring all the time, which led to a system that couldn't possibly function, and there were massive devaluations throughout the 70s. And you know that led to Black Friday, where the Brits came into the EMS very reluctantly. Thatcher didn't want to go in, but Major and others did, and the Brits couldn't cope. And in the end, they were forced out. And it's wonderful. I write in the book that in the first hour of that Friday in September, the Bank of England had bought more pounds than it had in the whole year or something like that. And they had an emergency meeting with Bundesbank officials just after lunch, and the Bank of England official recounts that suddenly the German bankers couldn't speak English. And it was, they didn't want to play ball, basically. What happened then, so we've got this necessity of fixed exchange rates. We've got quite disparate economic structures. We've got quite different motivations. So the French were never going to accept a supranational fiscal authority. And they also wanted a monetary union first, if there was going to be any union, and economic policies to be integrated afterwards. Whereas the Germans wanted the economic policies to be sorted out and unified before they'd give up their currency. So all of these things meant that the Werner Report could never succeed, the McDougall recommendations could never succeed, and so they go into the 80s without any union, but still a necessity for fixed exchange rates. Bretton Woods is gone, US dollars floated, and the domestic policies that European domestic policies to try to keep the fixed exchange rate going meant that there was entrenched unemployment, and that was because in France they agreed towards they agreed that they couldn't keep devaluing because that was obviously not a fixed exchange rate system. So they agreed that the only way they could keep the exchange rates fixed was through interest rate variations. And of course that meant that, just as in the Bretton Woods system, the external deficit countries were always facing domestic stagnation because the interest rates would go up. I mean, during the day, during that Black Friday, the Bank of England announced they're going to put interest rates up to 15%. Next morning, they were already 12, I think, from memory. And they said, well, so you get this idea that macroeconomic policy had just run out of control, that they were just putting out fires on an hourly basis because they were trying desperately to keep exchange rates stable, but there was no way they could do that. So what then emerges in the 80s, of course, is the rise of monetarism and the abandonment of Keynesian thinking. And that changed everything, because France, which had previously been Keynesian, and German, you wouldn't call them monetarists, they were auto-liberals because they had a sort of weird sort of free market philosophy, because they also had quite a coherent concept of social redistribution and welfare state. But by and large, they were sort of monetarists in their monetary policy. But the French basically gave up their Keynesian roots. There'd been a battle for right through the period after the war between the Keynesians and the planning side of the French government under Jean Monnet and the finance ministry, if you like, who were much more German oriented. And by the 80s, monetarism had basically taken over. It came from the American Academy and basically taken over. And the import of that is that the French basically became the first real monetarists. I mean, we often think of Thatcher as being the first monetarist government. She wasn't. It was the French government in the mid-70s. Raymond Barre was the finance minister, and he brought in the Barre plan, and it was called Barisma, and this was a really harsh austerity program. And Barre was similar to Maggie Thatcher in the sense that he was very rude, and he said that he was very vituperative with respect to taking on the workers and the trade unions and welfare recipients. And so that was a major shift. And even though Mitterrand, as a socialist French leader, reversed some of that, even he became a free market sort of neoliberal by the mid-80s. And that led then, of course, and by then the groupthink was becoming really entrenched. Nobody considered Keynesian economics to have anything. The austerity mindset was forming back then. And so what you had then was a renewed, so all the time you've got these people saying we've got to have, integration. And the next round of that, through the sequence of European Council and Commission meetings, was the Delors Committee. Jacques Delors was a previous French finance and economic minister, and then he became president of the European Commission. And it was the Delora Report that was the blueprint for the Maastricht Treaty. And Delors was pretty crafty. He had completely drunk the neoliberal Kool-Aid, but he also was very politically crafty because he deliberately excluded any of the politicians from his committee. The finance ministers were a very powerful group in the Commission and the Council, and he deliberately excluded them, and he only put central bankers on the committee and a couple of other bankers. And that was for two reasons. One, that the bankers had been excluded by Werner in the 70s, but also he knew that he could get quick consensus on all of the sticking points by only having central bankers, because they were locked into the monetarist groupthink much more than because the finance ministers would still be battling out on national issues. So you've got the Maastricht Treaty. The big difference between the two reports, between Werner Report and the Delora Report, was that Delora eschewed any notion of a federal fiscal capacity. And we then went, so there was all the machinery of Maastricht Treaty, Stability and Growth Pact, and in the late 90s we had the Convergence farce, where it was quite obvious that everyone was running smoke screens and accounting tricks to get to get within the budget and the debt limits. Germany thought that that these limits would exclude Italy. Of course, they in the end, Germany didn't even meet the strict criteria, and you get the classic. This is out of sequence. 3 doesn't mean 3. You get the classic statement by the German finance minister Theo Waegel when he was challenged that Germany couldn't meet the 3% deficit target under the convergence to stage 3 of the treaty. He said, well, 3 didn't mean 3.0, meaning that you could have 3.9 and still meet the criteria. And it was this sort of give and ad hocery that ran right through the convergence period. Hardly any of them qualified to go into stage 3. Hardly any of the countries. And Germany couldn't exclude Italy, who were well above the deficit and had their public debt well above the ratio, because then they would have had to exclude Belgium, and they couldn't do that. And of course, Italy's public debt ratio is falling when Germany's was rising and above the 60% limit, so they were hypocrites anyway. So it was an absolute farce. After it, we had a period of stability, so-called, and this was the so-called German job wonder, and I'm going to leave the job wonder because Joanne wants to talk about that. These are the mini jobs. The macro of it was that Germany, prior to the treaty, had relied on exchange rate manipulation to keep their export side competitive. And so the Bundesbank continually was running and devalued, keeping the exchange rate below its true value. And of course that gaming all of its partners, who were then forced under the exchange rate system into continual balance of payments crises. But after the common currency came in, of course Germany lost control over the manipulation of the exchange rate. So what they did was what we now call internal devaluation. They basically scorched their workers' capacity to earn income, real wage rises, and it was a dramatic increase in their competitiveness relative to their other partners, particularly Greece and Portugal and Spain, who didn't do anything particularly different. It's just that the Germans had deflated their domestic economy. The 2003 crisis is very interesting. That's the Stability and Growth Pact basically failed in its first couple of years. And it failed because Germany and France couldn't possibly meet the deficit limits. And they were put in so-called excessive deficit procedures. These were these highly formalised European bureaucratic processes. And of course, when the Council recommended that they be disciplined under those procedures, when the Commission recommended that, the Council, that's basically the finance ministers, were manipulated by Germany and France under their curious voting system to not take that recommendation seriously. That led to a major breach between the Council and the Commission. It was taken to the European Court of the highest court in Europe, and that court ruled in favour of the Commission. But by then, the real politic was that the Stability and Growth Pact had to be renegotiated because France and Germany couldn't meet it. It was crazy. What you learn from the crisis is that the basic design flaws of the system were exposed. It was incapable of meeting a major asymmetric shock, and the policy response made that worse. And there's been a meeting in Germany this week, and I believe Stiglitz, Peter Diamond, Christopher Sims, recent Nobel Prize winners in economics, have all come out and said that this is a crazy system where you have an institutionalised system that leads to pro-cyclical fiscal policy. So I've just got a couple. Here's Groupthink in action. This is IMF forecasts for Greece. So these are their forecasts for real GDP growth there, and this is what actually happened. This is their forecast for unemployment rates. This is what actually happened. And of course, those forecasts were the basis of their bailout plans and their austerity programs. And not long after, not when was it? 2012 in October, I think it was, from memory. The IMF admitted that they'd got all their modelling wrong, that they had been working on multipliers below 1, where the spending multipliers they now admit were probably about 1.7. Now, for students of economics in the room, you'll know what the difference between an expenditure multiplier below close to 0 and 1.7 means. It means exactly polar opposites. And that's groupthink. They were told that they were wrong, but they kept, and their forecasts were all built on these models, and they were consistently wrong. And as you know, I'm an econometrician, and so you know that forecasting, you get it wrong. But what you're aiming for is not systematic errors. The IMF and the OECD and the Treasuries and all of these groups make systematic errors because their models lead to overestimations of the negative consequences of fiscal policy interventions and underestimations of the negative consequences of austerity. So it's systematic, and you can see it. Another important groupthink in action. This is the measurement of OECD output gaps. Now, output gaps are important. Is that, yeah, the blue? So they're important inputs into determining what structural deficits are. And then that feeds into their excessive deficit procedures under the Stability and Growth Pact. Well, the actual decline in real output in 2009. So they're blowing their output gaps out by a considerable amount. So the output gaps, even if you assume they were in full employment at the start of 2009, their output gaps are way off. And look at Greece here. They were assuming Greece was over full employment, yet it had high unemployment even at the start of 2009. Another quick example, what happened when the Stability and Growth Pact was just a political thing, and the documentation that I go into shows that the sort of design of it had no economic, they admitted, had no economic justifications or reasoning. It just came out back of an envelope. The French guy who invented the 3% rule said, we just got a call from Mitterrand one night, we had to come up with a quick rule. So, it's quite an interesting account. And of course what happened in the 90s after the treaty was signed is that they then backfilled with all of these economic papers to justify why the fiscal rules being imposed were valid and optimal. And they came up with estimates that the average output gaps from 1975 to 1977 were of such a magnitude that there was no way that even the automatic stabiliser reaction to a crisis could exceed the 3% deficit limits. And of course, they just didn't understand how bad a crisis could get. Okay, so I've got one more minute. The options that I go through in the book are tightening the fiscal rules, and Merkel even this week has blamed because Europe's close to back in recession now. Germany declined in second quarter, negative growth. France, 0 growth for 2 quarters. Italy is back in recession. That's 65% of Europe output, Eurozone output. So. And her claim is that what we need is even more austerity. And so I go into all of the discussion there, and my view is that spending equals income. Someone's got to spend to get growth. If the private sector doesn't want to spend, the public sector has to be the growth engine. And I think what the crisis has taught us is that monetary policy isn't very effective at all. Fiscal policy is very effective, and notions of Ricardian equivalence are nonsensical. There's a whole range of characters in the European debate who were quite... The Commission has their sort of regular economists that puts on expert panels. And a lot of them are coming out of the woodwork now who were as key players in the design of the system in the late 80s. They're now saying, oh, well, yeah, we might need a federal fiscal capacity. Most of them are just wanting smart schemes about how to manipulate the 60% debt ratio. So sequester some of it into good debt and bad debt, and have a mutual fund for the below 60% and state and individual country responsibility for above it. Or they advocate things like a national unemployment scheme as an automatic stabiliser. But all of those schemes are still within the fiscal austerity straitjacket. So none of them will work. I talk in quite a lot of detail about this concept that's emerged called overt monetary financing. It's not a new concept. Abba Lerner clearly went into it in detail. And essentially I argue that the crisis would go away virtually tomorrow if the European Central Bank announced as the currency issuer that it would fund all deficits that were necessary, increase in deficits, such that the output gaps properly measured would be closed. And if the central bank did that, you would have growth immediately. The next day you'd have growth in Greece because Greece would announce a job guarantee and would be away. And if the European Central Bank, and I also explain how that can be done even within the rules of the treaties, which ban no bailouts. And I also say that what they've got to do is use the extraordinary emergency circumstances in the Stability and Growth Pact, and they could get away with doing that until they have time to change the treaty and put it on more footing. So even without a federal fiscal authority, they could survive if the European Central Bank did that. But the last set of chapters talks about exit, which I argue is the preferred option. And even Christopher Sims said this week that if he was advising Portugal, Spain and Greece, he'd advise them to exit. And there's very powerful reasons why exit is the only way forward for the nations. It would allow them to immediately restore currency sovereignty that they haven't got now. It would allow them to immediately prioritise domestic demand, which they can't do under the austerity straitjacket. It would allow them to set differential interest rates. And as Joanne will explain, I think part of the problem, of course, was the imbalances that emerged during the pre-crisis period, because the interest rates were uniform, and of course credit in Spain and Ireland became so cheap that it spawned the housing, and the lack of oversight of the prudential authorities was so poor that they had the housing booms. And so restoring your own sovereignty gives you central bank back. And then I go into this elaborate discussion about whether you should default or redenominate, and the preferred option is to redenominate. And there's all sorts of discussion about the legality of that. Okay, so that's all. Thank you.